Okay. Well, I just want to extend a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you to all of our attendees. Thank you for registering and joining us for today's webinar on the introduction to the ISO 20022 standard and registration process. This will be presented to us by Mike Tagai, the convener of the ISO 20022 registration management group. We just have a few housekeeping items to go over with all of our attendees this afternoon. So all attendees have been placed on a global mute. So we ask that you remain on mute. And if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them via the chat. You should see the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. If not, you can look at the top bar, the meeting control panel in WebEx, and you should be able to see the chat function. We're asking that if you're not muted already, that all attendees remain on mute. This will just allow us to have smooth sailing for our webinar this afternoon. Our presenter will be taking questions during the presentation. Janet has wonderfully volunteered to monitor and read off the chat questions. So if you entered your question and you're waiting on a response, it'll just be a moment until our presenter takes a break to answer some of those questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared with X9 members once the recording is available. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the webinar over to Mike Tagai to get us started.
And thank you all for gathering. My name is Mike Tagai. I'm the convener of the ISO 20022 Registration Management Group. I sit in Tokyo. It's already Wednesday in Tokyo, 6 a.m. The sun is about to come out, and it's good to be able to start this webinar to introduce, well, or maybe reintroduce what ISO 20022 is. It's been 20 years since the standard was sort of put forward, and as the payment banks using SWIFT are implementing ISO 20022, it's been quite a buzzword recently. But one of the key objectives of the ISO 20022 RMG is to communicate to the market about what ISO 20022 is and what it is not. So it is the utmost pleasure to be able to have this webinar for the guest from X9, which is a large stakeholder in the ISO community as well as the ISO 20022 community. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat box. I'll see if I can follow them as they come along. But Janet has kindly volunteered to read them out, so really appreciate it. So first of all, let's start from the organizational makeup, if I may. This is the entire ISO construct, and this particular slide was used when the TC68 community had been helping Ukraine capacity build around ISO standards, where the RMG was also one of those entities that provided some capacity building training. As you can see on the top, the ISO standards are basically run by the national standards body. You see ANSI from the US, which effectively would have delegated financial services related standards activities to X9. Just the same over here in Japan, there's a national standards body called JISC, which has delegated to the central bank, the Bank of Japan, its activities that relate to TC68 mirror committees in Japan. And so in the middle, you see the technical committee number 68, which looks after financial services. Currently, it has three subcommittees, subcommittee 2 for security, subcommittee 8 for reference data, which is the place where data standards are defined. SC9, subcommittee 9, is where information exchange is discussed, like how you transport data that was defined at SC8. That's where SC9 is, and apparently ISO 20022 is a standard for financial messaging. So SC9 becomes the owner, and that's the way these things are organized. There are other groups, advisory groups, working groups, study groups under TC68, but from the context of what the RMG is, you might be able to see some dotted lines reaching out to the RMG on the right of the chart. Historically, when the RMG was put together, probably 20 years ago, it started off as Working Group 4, directly under ISO TC68. Over time, as the standard became available, and then it became widely adopted. Back in 2015, around that time, the RMG decided to move out from the TC68 construct and become partner to the TC68 communities. And so that's the reason for the dotted line. And as you can see, there is SWIFT, which is acting as the registration authority for ISO 20022, directly contracted with ISO organization to provide registration services. We will talk about that later. But ISO 20022 is a standard that defines a method to develop financial messages. And SWIFT, in its capacity as registration authority, works with the market and the various entities within the RMG to make those messages available and ultimately publish in ISO 20022.org. So although it's the same entity, it's different from the messaging services that SWIFT provides, but they play an important role to make those messages available. So this was the organizational construct. Just a quick word of introduction of RMG is, and it really is a representative of the ISO 20022 user community. The reason why the ISO 20022 RMG stepped out of the TC68 construct is because the standard had already been defined, and it was time to think more about adoption, implementation, and within ISO, implementation matters are not part of the standards bodies. And so the RMG is more implementation focused. Some people call it like a glorified user group. But the role of the RMG is to really make sure that the ISO 20022 standard is well understood and well adopted in the market. And if there are any issues in terms of adoption and implementation, make sure that feedback is provided to the standards owner, which is ISO 20022, ISO TC68 SC9. And by providing the feedback into the standards owner, the standards owner could think about how to make the standard better. And that feedback loop creates a continuous improvement cycle to make ISO 20022 much more usable, adaptable, and close to what the user community would want to do. And in reality, what the RMG does is that it analyzes and considers new development requests. Those are called business justifications. If a market or a community wants to develop a new ISO 20022 message, it doesn't have to be a member of the RMG or any of the, let's say, ISO bodies. It can represent a community need and come to the RMG or the RA, the registration authority, say that we want to develop a new message, and then it will be deliberated. One activity that the RMG performs is to make sure that the ISO 20022 standard and the repository is not fragmented. Fragmented meaning that if there's one purpose, then there should be only be one message. So if there are duplicate messages serving the same purpose, the RMG would avoid to approve the creation of such new messages. And that's one of the key functions. And as the analysis goes forward, it needs to allocate appropriate resources from the SEGs, which is an abbreviation of Standards Evaluation Groups, which are really representatives of business content and business standard expertise to make sure that the proposed message and the draft message are fit for purpose to be used outside in the market. And so, and as ISO 20022 becomes more adopted, there would be issues, which means that the current standard or the current process may not be able to meet the market needs, or there is some disagreement within the process, then those matters get escalated to the RMG, so it can be resolved. And so that's the function of the RMG. We could say that the RMG is there to preserve the integrity of the ISO 20022 repository. And maybe that's one reason that we don't advertise that much. But given that ISO 20022 has been adopted and is being adopted in various ways, it's not just payments. The most active segment for the last 5-6 years has been derivatives reporting using ISO 20022. The largest, let's say, user within the repository are the securities messages, not the payment messages. Securities messages would have more than 300 messages. Payments has probably more than 100 messages. And it gets adopted in different ways by different networks, different market infrastructures. There are many markets that use ISO 20022 messages, but they do not use the Swift network, for example. And in those cases, a Swift user community would not know whether an ISO 20022 message is used here and there, but probably currently the ISO 20022 messages used by other communities and other networks outside of Swift could potentially be larger. And trying to understand the scale of adoption and who's using which message is one of the challenges that the RMG is currently looking into. So far, no questions. So what is the ISO 20022 standard? And I talked about the repository, and you can go to iso2022.org and browse around, and you can see that there are tons of information about ISO 20022 messages available. This is where the base message is housed. Currently, there are over 740 ISO 20022 messages across many business domains that I could introduce later. But in effect, ISO 20022 as a standard is not the financial message, but it's a method. It's a modeling methodology, and when you say syntax independent, it means that it's not just XML. Currently, there's also another syntax called ASN.1 that is available, and the most recent development is to make sure that the standard itself has a way to allow for additional syntaxes, such as JSON, for example, when people start to have a desire for more ISO 20022 standards for APIs. The next choice could be like, how can we use JSON using ISO 20022? So that is the area that we're looking into. Apparently, the process to develop ISO 20022 message does involve to make sure that the right definitions are provided across the actors of the process, and those are all housed in the repository, which can also be viewed from ISO 20022.org. And so for those who thought that ISO 20022 was a Swift message, I'm sort of just trying to put things into scope a little bit, that there's a little bit more than that. And where things started, ISO 20022 started as a development methodology. And I thought the next slide, this page, could resonate a little bit more about the, let's say, the vast population or scope of ISO 20022. I've sort of tried to segment into 5 pillars, and starting from the left, there's a standard, and this is the methodology. The second pillar is where the messages are developed or API resources are developed using ISO 20022 as a method. And that's where the RMG, DRA, the segs sit. And probably as X9, you would be familiar with the standards language on pillar 1 and pillar 2, where at the end of pillar 2, a message is developed and then it's housed and becomes viewable at ISO 20022.org. We call those base messages. And then comes the third pillar. For example, Swift as a network provider will take one or two of the base messages, let's say PAX008 or CAMT052 or whatever that's in the repository, and then it will apply its own, let's say, restrictions. And Swift has asked the group called CBPR Plus to define those restrictions against the base message. And those messages have been released. And for example, the payment banks using the Swift network have started to implement those ISO 20022 messages as defined by Swift. And that's the third pillar. And moving on to the fourth pillar, where if you were a bank using Swift CBPR plus messages, then this is a totally different dimension that on the third pillar, you would have Swift. In the future, you would have Fedwire, you would have chips applying their own restriction to the ISO 20022 base message, calling it their own ISO 20022 message format, for example. And all they want as network providers and market infrastructures is to make sure that the users conform to the rules and pass through the messages that are defined by the networks or the market infrastructures. But the users of the market infrastructures or the users of the networks do need to conform to those rules. But in Pillar 4, what's happening is that there are many processes within those, let's say, payment banks or custodial banks or FX players and such. For example, if you're a payment bank, you have to well, grab the message, scrutinize the message, screen against sanctions, put it through fraud detection, put it through your payment processing, store the data, and then eventually you might do regulatory reporting or client reporting. These are all different processes, and they interact with different parts of the messages, which is probably not organized as if there were a standard. And even further, when you go to the right, you have your own client, and then those clients need to be educated about the change in the format at pillar 3, and they could be asked to adapt their payment applications, or they may be asked that the statements that you're receiving are going to change. And apparently, the communication between pillar 4 and pillar 5 is still at a nascent stage if you take payments, for example. I put like a message flow diagram on top of this slide, just showing how a message flows between different pillars, where the debtor and creditor sit in pillar 5, the agents that are the banks sit in pillar 4. Everything goes through the network or the MIs, uh, who tell the participants what to do. And so you see that ISO 20022 could mean many things to different people. But I thought this particular page could be illustrative of what to expect going forward. So,
Mike, we do have a hand raised. I don't know if you want to take it. Let me see if I can
sure.
unmute. Ambria, you might have to do the unmuting. You're the host.
Okay, I just sent the. Okay, there we go.
There.
Hey, so I mean, the question is, I had a question on the previous slide when you were talking about how ISO 20022 standard it's not a schema, it's actually a methodology that translates into whatever schema you might want, for example, JSON. And the question was, like, in terms of that translation, is there a place I could find information on that? As I thought it was just an XML standard or XML schema.
Right. So to answer your question, the schema is defined, let's say, at the pillar 3, where if you want to go through a network, the network would have its validation rules and then define its schema. And well, the ISO 20022 started as providing XML, let's say, expressed formats as an output of the method. And well, the schema itself, including the validation rules, would be defined by each network. So, well, to answer your question, the formats themselves, as for the base message, can be viewed at iso2022.org. But you would have to go to each network to ask for what is your validation rule, what is your schema, especially if it's if it is XML. But now, when people start to talk about ISO 20022 for API resources, then the desire is to really break away from the constraints of those validations, and we're exploring how this could work with JSON, because you know, the concept of schema or validation becomes slightly different. The challenge is whether it was possible to get all schemas lined or linked up with the base message repository available on iso2022.org. And if that linkage is provided, probably it becomes much more easier to search for each schema that is relevant for each network or market infrastructure.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
So thanks for pointing that out, because it's one of the topics that we would want to discuss in ISO 20022. Then the next slide really describes how the process works. So we're talking about pillar 1 over here. And it has 8 parts. It talks about the modeling methodology. It talks about how you generate XML schema, and also there's a part that talks about how you generate ASN.1 as well. There's a part about registration, which is the part that binds Swift as a registration authority about what they should be registering and making available to the market. Just to note, there's a new part, part 9, that is currently being developed as a new work item, which is a new part that provides guidance into how to develop additional syntax, such as JSON. And this is a part that's being worked on under ISO TC68 SC9 WG4. And probably the revision of the standards will go through through this year and the first part of next year. And at that time, we'll be able to see what's starting to take place. And some of you might have seen a small booklet that can be downloaded from either ISO2022.org or from maybe the Swift website. But it describes how in Pillar 2, an ISO 20022 messages get developed in practice. And it starts from creating a business information model, but actually in reality, it starts from a submitting organization, which is a community that wants to develop an ISO 20022 message by submitting their data model, which essentially describes who would want to communicate with whom and what kind of data they want to exchange amongst each other to achieve what purpose. And so the business information model is really about who communicates with who. And you can start to sort of imagine a message flow diagram. And then on the second step, the logical message model is really about the definition of the data and the relation of the data to each other and some constraints on the data if that's needed. And those two combined together can be expressed and typically in XML today because it was the first syntax available, and 20 years ago probably that was the prevalent one. And for high volume, high value clearing, XML seems to still be quite popular, and it's still used quite widely. But now we're opening up to see what we can do with other syntax. And so this is the process at a high level. And then on the second pillar, which is where probably you would interact through X9 by putting people in the SEG, the Standards Evaluation Group and such. But this flow, which is also available in ISO2022.org, simply illustrates that everything starts from a submitting organization. You don't have to be an RMG member, you don't have to be an ISO body, but you have to come up with your the business process and the actors involved in those processes, the data that's required to transport. The RMG will check that there is a development need, that there's no overlap with existing messages. And then once approved for new development, it will be allocated to a particular SEG, a standards evaluation group, which is currently cut by business domain, like payment SEG, security SEG, FX SEG, cards and retail services SEG, trade finance SEG, derivatives sub-SEG. And most recently, from this year, we have an API resources SEG, which cuts across all business domains, and there's an appendix at the end. If we have time, I can run through, which shows which seg covers which business domain and how many messages they're looking after. And then the key role of the seg, of the standards evaluation group, which is to really business validate that the developed draft message amongst the submitting organization and the RA are fit for purpose for the business and can be sort of put forward and exposed to the market for use. Then the registration authority goes on and makes it available to the public. And so that is the message development process. The other part is that once a message is out there, then you have to go through an annual maintenance cycle, which means if there's a need to change the message, it will come from outside, which is a community, and you don't even have to be the initial submitter of the message. If you are a user or represent a community of users thinking that the message can be modified to make things better and much more effective, there's a change request process that you submit a change request, and those are all, the processes are all defined in ISO 20022.org. And then it goes through the SEG, the submitting organization, and it goes through an annual cycle. So as if you're familiar with Swift, for example, Swift has their annual message maintenance cycle. And just the same, the ISO 20022 process also has an annual maintenance cycle. But most recently, probably one of the hot topics going forward would be how can we make this maintenance cycle more flexible for those users who want faster change cycles, or for those users who would want to have a limited number of communities or participants impacted by a particular change. And most recently, the annual cycle has been made a little bit flexible by allowing for quarterly updates for what we call the external code sets, which are maintained outside of this annual process, but updated more frequently as there's always need to add a code or edit codes that can be pulled without affecting the entire message. So there's some sign of flexibility responding to market needs, but there's more to come in terms of making the maintenance process much more flexible. This slide probably needs more development because this talks to Pillar 4. Pillar 3 was about market infrastructures and network service providers picking up the ISO 20022 base message and then making modifications. But Pillar 4 was much more complex because there are various processes that the particular users of those messages, users of the networks and the market infrastructures have to modify, such as it could be screening against sanctions, it could be settlement processing, it could be fraud detection. All those things have to be pulled together and lined up. And probably that's a challenge of project management, project managing or program managing. All the changes required, especially for the payment banks, if they had been operating in an unstructured data environment for such a long time, requiring a lot of human effort to support the process. By moving to ISO 20022 messaging, they're now exploring how they can move from an unstructured data environment to a structured data environment so that they can allow machines to read the data rather than human beings and make the process much more efficient. So this slide probably will develop into like a whole set of deck to describe what's going on, what the complexity, what are the processes that are yet to be sort of guided in a standard way. So that was really a brief introduction. And the last picture over here is trying to describe how an ISO 20022 message could look like. The way we think about it is that it could be that the message itself is like a container on a freight train. It has all its compartments, and hopefully ISO TC68 SC8 could define as many ISO standards, but they don't have to be ISO standards. They're fit into the freight train or the container at a defined order. So putting high quality data in the right structure allows for machines to read it in a mechanical way, and hopefully as we start to see more new ISO messages, more new data definitions, new data introduced, it will help solve for some of the real life problems like financial crime or even data quality. And that's the reason why the ISO 20022 RMG is there to feel the market, providing knowledge about what ISO 20022 is and what it is not, what kind of processes are involved. In essence, we're trying to communicate that you don't have to be deeply involved in ISO. If you think you need rooms to improve the current ISO 20022 message, then the communities can come forward. And just before going into Q&A, I just wanted to show what's in the appendix. This is the current RMG membership, and there's about 40 members and growing probably not that rapidly. But I think as ISO 20022 starts to get more adopted, we might see a little bit more demand. You see the United States over here, and some are represented by countries and national standard bodies, and some are represented by TC68 liaison institutions. And we have new communities that joined after 2015. For example, Bank of England decided to join independently, such as DTCC or CFTC, although you have United States over here and the United Kingdom over here. That's the flexibility that the RMG allows. And the last page in the appendix shows all the business domains and the number of messages that were made available through those business domains. And so you see you have a lot of securities messages and such, and the business domains are cut into the segs as explained earlier. So that was it, and hopefully I have not confused you about what ISO 20022 is. I think we have a few minutes left, and I'd like to open up for questions if it's okay. Nothing in the chat?
Nothing in the chat. I also did want to remind everybody, sorry, this is Janet, that we are always looking for additional experts that we can put forward to any one of the SEGs. So please feel free to reach out to staff, me, or anyone on staff. And if you have any questions, we would certainly value any additional participation.
Mike, this is Steve. How often do the SEGs meet?
So the SEGs meet as required. For example, the payment SEG or the security SEG had like a monthly standing meeting. But given that they're very active, they are handling multiple submissions per month, and they may decide to create evaluation teams within the SEG. And so those evaluation teams could be meeting on a bi-weekly basis, depending on the demand and such. If you go to the other side, let's see, for example, the FX SEG probably hasn't had a standing meeting for quite a while. The trade finance SEG, very active these days. They at least meet on a monthly or sometimes on a bi-weekly basis. Cards, I'm not sure whether they have standing meetings. They respond to ad hoc requests as the card schemes make their changes and such. But it depends. You can put experts, business experts, into each SEG and contribute in the business areas that you think are relevant. And meetings are sort of minuted and recorded so that you can follow those discussions as you go.
Okay, thanks. If anybody wants to ask a question, if you'll raise your hand, we'll try to. I don't see any hands. Amber, you see anything?
Nope, nothing on my end.
Okay, let's have one last look.
But so if there are no other questions, I do just want to remind members or the attendees that Mike has allowed us to record this webinar today, and we will be sharing that with attendees once WebEx makes the recording available. So typically that will be most likely sometime tomorrow afternoon. I'll try to give a couple seconds more for a person to raise their hand or type something in the chat. But in the meantime, I'm sure Steve and Janet would agree. Thank you so much, Mike, for volunteering to give this webinar and to present this information for us today. It was very informative. And let me just, yes, we have some feedback in the chat. Again, so thank you again, Mike, for the wonderful presentation. Like Janet mentioned, if you are interested in any of these initiatives, you can reach out to staff. You can contact us at admin, ADMIN at xline.org, and we will be more than happy to get you set up. So
right, maybe in closing, probably what I'd like to say is that the ISO communities or the ISO 20022 RMG and the SEGs are really made up of volunteers. And, you know, probably some people are paid to do this, but people try to find the right time to participate in all these things and contribute in their time. So, well, anybody, any firm that supports those standards and market practice building activities, always welcome. And, you know, ISO is not a trade secret, it's not a patent, it's a standard that's supposed to make the world more let's say, efficient. So I'm happy to welcome any volunteer that's willing to work with us. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Alrighty, well, that will end our webinar today. Again, thank you everyone for participating and joining, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.